can you tell us a little bit more about the conference? How many times, how do you know about it? How many times you've been to this conference? And what's the significance of discussing McIntyre in our modern society?
Your factual question first, how many times I've been to it. This is my first time. I think it's been going for 10 years, but I've never been at it before. I'm enjoying it thoroughly, I have to say. It's very intense, lots of discussion. Why, your second question about why is it important to be talking about McIntyre now? Well, he's talking about everything that's going on in the world, or that, you know, everything we're about as human beings in a very powerful way, and in a way that sort of stirs up a lot of discussion, because he doesn't see things as most people do, or most philosophers do. He's got a very strong position of his own, which one has to contend with. And I find that this particular conference is one of the reasons why it's very good, I think, is that unlike other conferences, there's a certain sort of shared, not that everybody agrees, thank God they don't. I mean, there's lots of disagreement and interesting discussion, but it's fruitful discussion, more fruitful because people have a shared background of text that they're familiar with. In other words, but rather than being kind of turned in on itself as it might be, because we're dealing with one man, his ideas are so rich, I think most of us feel, all of us probably feel, we wouldn't be here, that the fact that we have some common reference points, it frees the discussion to go in all directions, purposefully, I think, in a way that wouldn't necessarily be the case at other kinds of conferences.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Thank you. Did you want?
Well, I'm here for the second time. I mean, I came last year in Paris to the Paris conference. I'm based in Paris. I got to know McIntyre a long time ago in the 1970s, so I've been reading him for a while. I feel that his philosophy has been extremely important for me in terms of giving me the conviction that philosophy is really something to be done, to be practiced, and provides us with a critical perspective on not just on the things that we most obviously dislike about the world, such as inequality and unemployment, but also some of the false responses to those problems. So I think he has a doubly critical perspective, and I think he's developed that within a philosophical framework which allows the possibility of spiritual belief and commitment and an understanding of what it is to be a human being. So I think it's a very, very rich perspective indeed, and I think the ability to be able to discuss his thought with people who know it very well, and better than me, no doubt, is something which I find enriching.
I was just wondering about the translation to practice, and in the context of teaching, for example, in my context in finance and accounting, in the professions at large. I just wonder, do you think that there is a translation, and in a way, if there isn't enough, which that's my perception, how can we actually, I'm not saying we need to sell McIntyre, or utilize him or use him as a tool, which is not the right way to do that. You need to, the way of thinking needs to change. And so that, I think, it's a bit of an issue, because you need the conceptual capacities and the capacity of judgment to even get to that stage of thinking that McIntyre relates to us. So how can we actually enrich practitioners, or how can we translate, or is there a message or something that we can actually point our finger to in terms of what we need to focus on and develop in practitioners and teachers, for example, or in professional accountants? I don't know, that's what I'm dealing with.
I think it's a question that's properly addressed to every philosopher. In that, from the beginning philosophy, if you go back to Socrates in Athens, he went around with very ordinary people, met them in the baths, met them in the streets, in the pubs, if there were, whatever the equivalents were in Athens. He wasn't an academic philosopher. That happened a little bit later. So, it was the love of wisdom, and wisdom is about how to live a better life, how to die a better death. And more than most philosophers, more than almost any other, and probably Ronan might share this view, I mean, there are other philosophers very drawn to as well, but he's one of the ones who does this, I think, best, and does it best in terms of keeping on the table the questions that do concern ordinary people. We're all ordinary people. Some of us, have had the advantage of having an education that's helped us to become more professional kind of philosophers.
Yeah.
But the real philosophers, as McIntyre really recognises, are everybody. We all have to live our lives. And he's one of the philosophers who actually sees theory as not having a justification just for itself as pure theory. The purpose of theory is to help practice to understand itself better. This was Socrates' point as well. Human beings understand yourself, live the examined life, and I think McIntyre does help in lots of different areas, actually, both in education, because actually the very notion of practice is one that he has thought about very, very well. And many of us have taken on board that notion of practice. And although it's a theoretical concept, and his writings can be difficult enough to read, but nonetheless, he's giving us, I think, material there that we can quite easily, your word is translate. They don't take a lot of, difficult mediations to translate them. I think ordinary people who are involved, in any kind of craft, be it as a teacher, as a social worker, as a lawyer, as a builder or whatever. He's really interested in what goes on in areas like that help people to do things well. What does doing things well in these different areas mean? And we're all interested in that, I think.
Yeah. Because my context is working with a professional body, collaborating with one of the professional bodies in an Institute of Chartered Accountants, and my hunch is that the role of a professional body is exactly to open up this space for deliberation and enable, provide the standards of excellence to the practitioners, like create that translation and mediation, and enable that space in which that kind of purposeful thinking should happen, rather than just look at qualifications and standards. I think capacity building in the teaching profession, for example, is a very important point, rather than just focusing on evaluation and inspection practices, looking at how do we build capacity in our practitioners to develop that kind of purposeful practice, reflective practice.
Yeah, I think I would add to what Joe was just saying, that it's important to realize that thought itself, reflective thought, is a practice and is an action. And we need to keep a hold on that, because we have a tendency to think of thought as something which is disengaged. Genuine thought, genuinely reflective thought, is an engaged practice which is part of what it is to be a reflective human being. If you're going to do that in any profession, you're going to have a critical perspective on the way in which your profession is run, on the standards that are required of those who practice it, on the ethics of the profession itself, and the kind of ends to which it's devoted. And perhaps also you might want to ask yourself a serious question. To take the example of being a lawyer, it's a question which I asked somebody the other day, whether or not being a good lawyer is something which is a good thing to do. And that's a question you need to ask, I think, more broadly within the profession itself, but also as a person who aspires perhaps to be a lawyer. Is my good as a human being going to be accomplished by becoming a good lawyer?
Right.
And that's an important question to ask of any profession and of any direction in human life.